What's happening now is federal prosecutors are re-examining the evidence they have and trying to decide whether they can charge anybody else who may have assisted Epstein over the years, any co-conspirators, folks who may have been planning to cooperate against Epstein in that federal prosecution may actually now be the targets of the investigation themselves. Well, there's lots of questions surrounding it. Primarily the viability and applicability of the non-prosecution agreement that Epstein signed more than a decade ago in Florida. There's some thinking that that non-prosecution agreement might be applied more broadly to any potential co-conspirators than Epstein himself. I think prosecutors also have to decide to which extent potential co-conspirators might also be considered victims of Mr. Epstein. I mean, according to police reports the Associated Press has reviewed, there's some indications that co-conspirators, employees, associates of Mr. Epstein were previously victims of his in some instances. So that will complicate any further prosecutions. If Mr. Epstein did in fact take his own life, as is suspected, we don't know exactly what the trigger of that was. There's certainly been speculation that this happened less than 24 hours after more than 2,000 pages containing explosive details were filed into the public record, but we don't know for certain that that was a contributing factor. So the autopsy has been conducted, but the New York City Medical Examiner's Office has said essentially that they are awaiting further information. This is not an atypical status, and particularly given the profile of the case, they are going to want to cross their T's and dot all the I's. And so it could actually be weeks, if not months, before we have an official death certificate that's issued. So the autopsy is going to show us everything. It's going to show us the cause and manner of death. The medical examiner will decide whether this in fact was a suicide. And also reveal the extent of injuries that Mr. Epstein suffered. And it's possible we'll also have a sense of exactly when those injuries occurred. There's been some speculation that this happened potentially hours before the guards, who were not monitoring him as they should have been. The autopsy will give us the clearest window yet as to what happened. And yet another legal front worth mentioning will be the probate proceedings surrounding Mr. Epstein's estate in New York. We do not know yet whether Mr. Epstein had a will. We don't know yet who will inherit the tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars he had to his name. And there could be fights over the proceeds of his properties. The federal authorities in Manhattan, in charging Jeffrey Epstein with sex trafficking and conspiracy charges last month, sought to seize many of those assets, including his $77 million mansion in Manhattan. And so it's going to be interesting to see how those proceedings play out as well. And in fact, once the estate is executed, it's quite likely the federal government will seek those proceedings to be stayed until they've made a decision, because anything that is deemed evidence is going to have to remain in federal custody, essentially until the Justice Department is done with its inquiry.
But ultimately it could be returned to his estate.
It could be, and then distributed, sold for, liquidated, sold for assets, and then potentially distributed as compensation, damages to victims.